The day my wife died, my son shook my hand at the graveside. Not a hug, a handshake. I remember thinking that was strange. We used to hug. We used to be the kind of family that hugged. That was 3 years ago. I should have paid more attention to the handshake. My name is Douglas, and I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a land surveyor in British Columbia, most of it working contracts up near Prince George and Kamloops, before retiring to the house my wife and I bought in Kelowna in 2003. A modest split level on a quiet street backing onto a creek. My wife Carol planted rose bushes along the back fence every summer. After she passed, I kept watering them. I'm not sure why. Habit, maybe, or something to do with my hands in the morning. My son. I'll call him my son throughout this because that's what he was to me for 41 years, whatever he became at the end. He lives in Burnaby with his wife. They have 2 kids, a boy and a girl. I used to drive the 4 hours to see them every few months. We'd have dinner, watch hockey. The grandkids would show me things on their tablets that I didn't understand. Normal. Good even. My daughter-in-law. I'll call my daughter-in-law. She's the kind of woman who smiles with her whole face but never with her eyes. I noticed it early on, before they were even married, but Carol said I was being unfair. Maybe I was. I wanted to be wrong about her. The trouble started, as far as I can tell, about 8 months after Carol died. That's when my son called me and suggested very gently, very reasonably, that I think about updating my estate documents. He said he'd spoken to a lawyer friend of his. He said it would give everyone peace of mind. He said Carol would have wanted things to be organized. I didn't love the conversation, but I didn't hate it either. It wasn't unreasonable on its face. I was 68, I'd just lost my wife, and I hadn't looked at my will in 15 years. So I said I'd think about it. What I didn't know then was that my son wasn't suggesting I see my own lawyer, he was suggesting I see his. 2 months later, on a Sunday afternoon, they drove out to Kelowna. Said they wanted to spend the weekend, check in on me. My daughter-in-law made dinner. The kids ran around the backyard near Carol's roses. It was a nice evening, actually. The kind of evening that lowers your guard. The next morning, my son put a folder on the kitchen table next to my coffee. He said it was just paperwork, a new will and a financial power of attorney naming him as my decision-maker in case I became incapacitated. Standard stuff, he said. The lawyer had drafted it already, just needed my signature. I looked at the documents. They were 43 pages. I said I'd want to read them first. He said, of course, take your time. But then he mentioned the lawyer was only available that week, that his schedule filled up fast. My daughter-in-law came in from the kitchen and said it would really set their minds at ease, knowing things were taken care of. I signed. I am not proud of that. I have thought about it many times since. I was still grieving. I was tired. My son was sitting across from me with that earnest face he used to make as a little boy when he wanted something, and part of me was so desperate to believe that we were still the family we used to be that I didn't stop to read what I was signing. I signed a power of attorney that gave my son broad authority over my finances. I signed a new will that, I would later discover, removed the bequest I'd set aside for my late sister's daughter in Nova Scotia and replaced it with everything going to my son and daughter-in-law, held in a family trust they controlled. I didn't find any of this out right away. What I found out 7 months later, on a Wednesday afternoon in October, was something I wasn't supposed to hear at all. I had driven to Burnaby to see the grandkids for the Thanksgiving long weekend. My son had offered to pick me up from the bus station, but I still had my truck then, and the drive doesn't bother me. I arrived about 2 hours earlier than expected because the highway was clear. I let myself in with the spare key they'd given me years ago and called out that I was there. No one answered. The house seemed empty. I set my bag down in the front hallway and walked toward the kitchen to make tea. The door to the back study was half open. I could hear my son's voice, low, and my daughter-in-law's voice answering him. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I just stopped because I heard my name. My son said, "We need to move before he changes his mind." My daughter-in-law said, "He won't. He doesn't understand what he signed." My son said, "The RRSP beneficiary still needs to be updated. The house is the bigger problem. We can't touch it until—" My daughter-in-law said, "I know, but if we list it now, while the market in Kelowna is—" My son said, "He'll fight it." My daughter-in-law said, "Not if we do it right. Not if he thinks it's his idea." I stood in the hallway for what felt like a very long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. I remember looking down at my hands and noticing they weren't shaking. I thought they should be shaking. I walked back to the front door, opened it, and closed it louder than necessary. "Hello?" I called out. "Just got here. Traffic was good." They came out of the study smiling. I smiled back. Dinner that evening was roast chicken. My grandson showed me a Lego set he'd been working on. My granddaughter fell asleep on the couch watching a movie. My son poured me a glass of Okanagan Red and asked how I was holding up. I said I was fine, keeping busy, thinking about putting in a vegetable garden next spring. He said that sounded like a great idea. I went to bed early, claiming I was tired from the drive. I lay on the ceiling until well past midnight. Here is the thing about being 68 that I don't think younger people fully understand. You have been lied to before. You have watched people smile and mean something else entirely. You have sat at kitchen tables and known somewhere in your chest that the conversation was not really the conversation. You get better at this over time, not because you become suspicious of everyone, but because you've lived long enough to know the difference between warmth and performance. What I heard in that hallway was not complicated. My son and his wife intended to sell my house. They believed the power of attorney I'd signed gave them the ability to do that. They wanted to move before I understood enough to stop them. The next morning, I said I needed to get back earlier than planned. I hugged my grandkids. I shook my son's hand. Funny how that came back around, and I drove to Kelowna. I did not go home. I drove to the office of a woman named Patricia Osei, a wills and estates lawyer on Bernard Avenue, whose name I'd seen on a sign near the grocery store for 2 years and never thought twice about. I had no appointment. Her assistant told me she was with a client. I said I would wait as long as necessary. I waited 40 minutes. Then I sat across from Patricia Osei and told her everything. I put the copy of the POA folder on her desk. I had photographed every page of the documents the morning after I signed them, a small act of caution I couldn't explain at the time, but was now grateful for, and watched her read. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I want you to listen carefully, because I'm going to tell you some things that may be upsetting." She told me the POA was valid. I had signed it willingly in what appeared to be sound mind, and there was no clear evidence of undue influence. It would be difficult to challenge on that basis alone. However, she said there were conditions under which the POA's authority was limited. It did not give my son the right to sell my primary residence without my consent unless I had been formally assessed as mentally incapacitated by a medical professional, which I had not been and was not. Under British Columbia law, a POA does not override the owner's right to their own home unless specific legal thresholds are met. She said, "They may not know this." I said, "They probably don't." She said, "Which means they may proceed as though they have authority they don't actually have." I said, "Yes, that's what I think, too." Patricia Osei is a careful woman. She didn't tell me to do anything dramatic. She told me to do 4 specific things. First, book an appointment with my family doctor and have it noted in my medical records that I was mentally competent and of sound mind. Second, contact my bank and flag the account so that any significant withdrawal or transfer would require two-factor verification to my personal phone. Third, have a new will drafted immediately under her supervision, revoking the previous one, and file it promptly. Fourth, wait. Let my son and daughter-in-law believe I was still unaware. Gather information. Document everything. I did all four things within 2 weeks. My doctor, a man I've seen for 12 years, wrote a letter. My bank, TD, on the same street, added the security flags within a day. Patricia drafted a new will naming my niece in Halifax as executor alongside a professional trustee, distributing assets in a way that reflected what Carol and I had actually wanted. She filed it the same week. Then I waited. My son called me on the 1st of November and said he'd been doing some research and thought it might make sense for me to think about downsizing. The Kelowna market was strong. It might be worth having the house appraised just to know where things stood. I said that was interesting. I said I hadn't really thought about it. He said he could arrange the appraisal. He had a contact. I said, sure, why not? The appraiser came on a Tuesday. He walked through every room with a clipboard. I offered him tea. He declined politely. Before he left, I asked him who had commissioned the report. He said my son's name. I called Patricia that afternoon. She said that's consistent with someone who believes they have authority to sell the property. It's not a legal action yet, but it's preparation for one. She said, "Are you ready to move forward?" I said yes. Patricia contacted my son's lawyer, not my son directly, but the lawyer who had drafted the original POA documents, and informed him that I had retained independent legal counsel, and that any actions taken under the POA with respect to my primary residence would be contested as an unauthorized use of authority under the BC Power of Attorney Act. She copied the Law Society of British Columbia. She also sent a letter directly to my son, informing him that the will signed in his kitchen the previous year had been revoked and replaced, and that the new will had been registered with a law firm in Kelowna. I was not copied on his response. Patricia summarized it for me later. He had written that there must have been some misunderstanding, that his intentions had always been to protect my interests, and that he was happy to discuss things as a family. Patricia wrote back and said there was nothing to discuss at this time. 2 weeks later, my son called me, not to argue. He called and asked if I wanted to come for Christmas. His voice had that careful quality it gets when he's trying to figure out how much I know. I said I'd think about it. There is a particular loneliness in this kind of situation that I don't think gets talked about enough. It is not just the betrayal, though that is real, and it sits in your chest like a stone you carry everywhere. It is the grief on top of grief. Carol had been gone barely a year. We had built 40 years of a life together, and part of how I survived her loss was believing that what we built still meant something, that the family we raised still carried it forward. To find out that my son had been sitting at tables with me, hugging me at Christmas, calling to check in, and at the same time calculating what my house was worth. That requires a kind of recalibration I was not prepared for. You don't just lose the future you expected. You lose some of the past too, because you start to look back and wonder what was real. I went to my doctor again, not for legal reasons this time, but because I was struggling to sleep. He was kind about it. He said grief complicated by betrayal was its own particular weight, and that there was no timeline for carrying it. I started taking walks in the morning along the creek behind the house. The rose bushes had made it through another winter. I did not go to Burnaby for Christmas. In January, Patricia informed me that my son's lawyer had quietly withdrawn from the matter. She suspected, and I agreed, that once the lawyer understood the legal situation clearly, he'd advised my son that proceeding would expose him to significant legal and reputational risk. Under BC law, misusing a power of attorney can constitute financial elder abuse, which is a criminal matter. There was no lawsuit. There was no confrontation in a room with police and frozen faces under bad lighting. That's not how it happened. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, harder to process than a dramatic confrontation would have been. My son called in February. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. He drove to Kelowna alone, without his wife. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd put that folder 2 years earlier, and he talked for a long time. He said things about financial pressure, about the cost of living in Burnaby, about his wife's involvement in the original idea. He cried at one point. I watched him cry and felt something I still can't name cleanly, some mixture of love and sorrow and a kind of cold clarity that I hope I never feel toward anyone again. I didn't yell. I didn't tell him what I knew or when I'd known it. I let him finish. Then I said, I know everything. I have known since October. I have had a lawyer since November. He went very still. I said, I am not going to press charges. I am not going to call the police. What I am going to do is tell you that I will never sign any document you put in front of me again, and that if anything happens to my finances or my property, Patricia Osei has instructions on what to do next. He nodded. He didn't argue. I said I would like to still know my grandchildren. I don't know yet what that looks like with respect to you. He drove back to Burnaby that evening. I am still working out what the relationship looks like now. It is not nothing, but it is not what it was. Some things, once you see them, cannot be unseen. I still water Carol's rose bushes in the morning. I still have tea on the porch when the weather allows. Patricia Osei reviews my documents once a year, and my bank still has the security flags on the accounts. My niece in Halifax calls more often now, which is a kindness I didn't expect. Last spring, I put in that vegetable garden I mentioned at Thanksgiving dinner, the one I told my son about while I was still pretending not to know what was coming. Tomatoes, kale, a row of carrots that came in better than expected. I thought about Carol when I planted it. I thought about the handshake at the grave. I think people underestimate how much quiet work it takes to protect yourself from someone who loves you badly. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like an old man watering his garden and calling his lawyer and going to bed at a reasonable hour. But it is the hardest thing I've ever done. There's a moment in that Burnaby hallway I keep coming back to. Not the words themselves, though I've replayed those enough times, but the stillness I felt after. My hands weren't shaking. I think that surprised me more than anything I heard through that half-open door. I've thought about why, and I think it's because somewhere underneath the shock I already knew. Not the specifics, not the appraisal, not the listing plan, not the exact shape of what they were building behind my back, but the handshake at Carol's graveside that had told me something I hadn't let myself finish thinking. What my son did was wrong. I don't soften that. He looked at his father, a man still carrying the weight of losing his wife of 40 years, and he saw an asset to be managed before it slipped out of reach. That is a moral failure, and naming it plainly matters. Not out of bitterness, but because I think we do each other a disservice when we explain away that kind of betrayal with words like pressure and circumstance. Pressure doesn't make you sit across from your grieving father and smile while planning to sell his home. That's a choice. It comes from somewhere inside a person, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. But here's what I also know. I made it worse by not paying attention sooner. Not paying attention to the handshake, not reading 43 pages before I signed them. I had moved through that first year of grief in a kind of fog, and I had let that fog make decisions for me. The moment I walked out of that hallway and started thinking clearly, really thinking, not reacting, everything changed. I drove straight to Bernard Avenue. I sat in a waiting room for 40 minutes. I put photographs of documents on Patricia Osei's desk, and I listened, and I understood. That's what I mean when I say the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. The hardest part was deciding to be clear-eyed about my own situation, even when being clear-eyed meant accepting that my son had done this, that it was real, that I wasn't going to wake up from it. It takes something, a steadiness, a willingness to face what's in front of you without flinching, to sit across from your own lawyer and say, "I know everything," out loud for the first time. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a retired land surveyor from Kelowna who grows tomatoes and calls his niece in Halifax on Sunday evenings. But I've come to believe that how you come through something like this has less to do with luck than people want to admit. It has to do with whether you're willing to act on what you know, even when acting is harder than pretending. Whether you have enough left in you to protect yourself not from anger, but from clarity. Whether you can look at the people you love and still tell the truth about what you see. Carol used to say that the kindest thing you can do for someone is not let them get away with less than they're capable of. I didn't understand that fully when she was alive. I think I do now. The rose bushes came back this spring. So did I.